Hey folks, thanks for watching. It's Tuesday, August 19th. I want to cover a few things in the video here today. One, we'll look at the tropics, major hurricane Erin. Do want to talk about finally some relief from temperatures, a cool down coming to much of the central and eastern U.S. Not only this week, but really diving down in this weekend, getting these fall-like temperatures in, and I think that's going to continue. There's some persistence with that for some time. I want to talk about the monsoon a bit. Saw some activity yesterday, some flash flood warnings in southern New Mexico, but I think that activity might be trending up even in the long term. And then I do want to translate that into a conversation at the end of this video on the Colorado River levels, California reservoirs. We're seeing this kind of La Nina southern oscillation conversation get going. Last week, the Climate Prediction Center releasing a La Nina watch, so there's some implications for where we're going, I think, with this water year that we can finally talk about out west. It's been a while since we've kind of touched base there. If we do look over the last 24 hours of precipitation, there's those infrared returns that we saw over northern Illinois, portions of Iowa, even some flash flood warning issues in here as well, and some of these storms spinning here over the Four Corners region, the Western Plains, and the Continental Divide as well. If I just show the same kind of radar-derived precipitation from the last 24, if I make it 72 hours in the past, you can see this stripe here. From northern Illinois up through Minnesota, this has just been a very busy stretch for precipitation. But jump over and show you a closer look. This is Hurricane Erin here this morning. Again, it looks pretty ragged. It does have this kind of inner core of thunderstorms, but you'd be hard-pressed to tell me where an eye is here. I mean, this looks like a storm that's really more on the cusp of Category 2 strength, not necessarily Category 3. So we'll see what the National Hurricane Center says this morning. Maybe even by the time I publish this, they'll have downgraded it to a 2. But the tropical wind field, like the envelope around the storm, has actually been expanding. So that's going to increase actually some impacts, I think, to the U.S., regardless of how strong this inner core is, which is how they actually rate it on the Saffir-Simpson scale. If we look at the National Hurricane Center, their official forecast here, they actually published that tropical storm envelope of winds, and you can see how big it is. It looks like a big beach ball here. So if you just take and translate this beach ball to a position when the storm is going to be up here on Thursday, east of North Carolina, I mean, maybe something like that, and you're getting very close to the Outer Banks. You can see why they released this tropical storm watch for the Outer Banks, even though Erin's expected to stay, relatively out to sea at this point. And we're already seeing rip current issues up and down the eastern seaboard. There were literally hundreds of rescues yesterday, and that's only going to continue all week. I mean, even by Friday, this thing is still just kind of east of Virginia here. So I'm kind of imploring folks, stay out of the water here. These things are deadly, and it's been busy already, and we haven't even gotten into the week, like the meat of the week yet. If we look at the all hazards risk this morning from NOAA, I'll update this close to the recording of this video. And orange can see these heat advisories across the middle Mississippi Valley, kind of at the center of them, these extreme heat warnings. Some of these have been posted for the Southwest as well. We're seeing this ridge that has been maybe centered more so over like St. Louis or Cairo, Illinois, bringing this heat here, starting to translate further west. So we're going to see more heat here and that cool down coming for the central and eastern U.S. as we go through the forecast. You can also see these like salmon colors near North Carolina and Virginia. These are tropical storm watches just off the coast here. If we look at the 500 millibar winds here this morning, there's Hurricane Erin there spinning east of the Bahamas, and we don't really see that ridge here now over the central and eastern U.S. This is what brought that heat in over the weekend at the end of last week. And we're now seeing this more proper ridge over Salt Lake, maybe over Utah, Colorado. We're seeing this troughing here near British Columbia. This is actually what's going to be helping usher in this cold spell. When this translates, it's going to ride this ridge up and over Saskatchewan into Manitoba and then diving down into the Midwest. And that's going to bring a cold front and much cooler fall-like temperatures this weekend for much of the central and eastern U.S. I'll take a look at that temperature forecast in just a second. I do want to play this 3-kilometer NAM forecast out this morning. We are seeing some thunderstorms push through central Illinois and Indiana here this morning. I'll make this valid for like 3, 4, 5 p.m. Let's do 6 p.m. this evening. So you actually see this kind of weak front stretching from like Ontario, Windsor, Canada, some thunderstorms there, through Indianapolis into southern Illinois, Arkansas, Oklahoma. Thunderstorm activity continuing a little bit overnight. Going to be sparse in terms of coverage. If I take the forecast into tomorrow, 5 p.m., 6 p.m. Wednesday, you can now see that line anywhere from like New York, West Virginia, Kentucky, through Mississippi into Texas. Some spotty showers and thunderstorms continuing over the Four Corners over this time period. And then finally by Thursday, a lot of that activity now pushing off the Gulf Coast. There's major Hurricane Erin east of North Carolina here. You can see, fortunately, the expectation it does stay off the eastern mainland U.S. and then potentially seeing a thunderstorm risk area here up into Thursday, the Dakotas and Minnesota. We'll jump over and just show you quickly the SPC forecast over that time period. Let's scroll down here. No major risk areas, just marginal here today along that line we discussed from like Indianapolis toward Oklahoma City, and then maybe some thunderstorm risk here in the eastern Dakotas and Minnesota as we get into the day on Thursday. Otherwise, pretty light across the U.S. in terms of severe storm risk, and we do see Arizona getting in on some of this rainfall outlook, so some chance for storms here as this monsoon activity starts to sprinkle in some more activity. Now, I mentioned keep an eye on this British Columbia trough. We're looking at the 500 millibar height anomalies from the ECMWF here. And there's that ridge over Salt Lake that's bringing more heat to the west. And here comes that trough over the Central US. We're now getting into Sunday afternoon, pushing through New England by Tuesday, even taking the forecast out 10 days, seeing this ridge even expand up into Canada here, and more troughing across the eastern US. So this is a pretty pronounced cool down that's on its way for much of the central and eastern part of the country. If you look at the max temperatures here today from the National Weather Service, there's those extreme heat warnings. Arkansas, western Mississippi, heat advisories for eastern Montana, some of the extreme heat warnings for southwest Arizona. I'm going to take this forecast into tomorrow, Wednesday. You see that heat expanding west, continuing across California, Oregon, more heat expanding here on Thursday. But here it comes on Friday. There's that trough sneaking around the ridge, bringing that cool down to the Great Plains. More heat across the west as we get toward the weekend. Saturday, Sunday, much more significant cool down now. Highs in the 70s for a wide area, even 60s in northern Minnesota. And then dropping well into the 70s here for Kansas, a much wider area of more fall-like temperatures. This is now Monday, August 25th. The overnight temperatures, I took them all the way out to Monday. You can even get some 40s in here, the Red River in the north, maybe even into Iowa here, 50s across a wide area of the central US. So this is a fall-like weekend. I think at least a taste of it early on in August, where we're headed for autumn. And then if we look over in the western US, there's the warmth as that ridge settles in there. With the WPC, their 7-day forecast, a lot of this activity kind of staying off toward the Gulf Coast states. There's Hurricane Erin that we can see there. Fortunately, New England, as some of these fronts come through and stall here, getting some precipitation up there. This area has been very dry over the kind of the last 30, maybe even like 50 days at this point. So good to see some proper precipitation signals come in here for Ontario, Canada, even up into the Maritimes as well. And then over here in the upper Midwest, some activity here moving through this area, but really kind of this area going over dry in the longer term. With that colder Canadian air coming out of the northwest, we're starting to lose that kind of northwest flow phenomenon as we get later and later in the year, and there's kind of less moisture just lingering around the Midwest. We do see some activity picking up here in the Western Plains, Kansas, the Oklahoma Panhandle region, and then Colorado, and starting to see a little bit more monsoon activity. We don't see like, clear, obvious big increases, but we do have this kind of lingering like 20% daily storm chance over the next 7 days, and that could start to add up for a few areas getting on some measurable precipitation. Look at this, just 7-day precipitation anomalies from the ECMWF. Again, you can kind of see that drier corridor that I painted here from the Canadian Prairie toward the Midwest. Wetter here near the Front Range, seeing some monsoon activity pick up in the southwest. The southeast stays wet, New England staying wet. You can see something of a drier corridor picking up here as these temperatures cool off a bit. Take the forecast well out. This is from the ECMWF ensemble. We saw this at the end of the ECMWF run. There's that ridge that was kind of magnified here over Utah in the near term, that like 5-day forecast. It's starting to push further to the north. And as we build heat in here, it allows that monsoon to pull up a little bit more moisture. So what I expect as we get further out into the forecast, I took this all the way out to August 31st. So we're getting well toward the end of the month. I think we're going to see a trend up in monsoon activity here. With this large ridge over Canada, it's helping a trough dive down into the central and eastern U.S. So this kind of cooler spell continues into the long range, even out into late next week from the ECMWF ensemble. And then with this little trough here, should this verify, maybe getting some precipitation into the Pacific Northwest finally. If you look at the ECMWF ensemble, the 8 to 14 day precipitation anomalies here. This is the 12Z, there's the 0Z, there's that update. Again, this corridor here is staying drier in the long range. This is taking us all the way from the 27th of the month out to September 2nd. Whereas the southwest, the Intermountain West goes over wetter. Southern Plains, Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, hoping to see this. This corridor here has been dry and hot over the last 20 days, so getting some precipitation signal now here in the long range, which should be good news. But drier in the Gulf, drier down here. You're starting to see maybe a break from some tropical activity, and that's consistent with some signs that we've seen from the MJO that we maybe won't see as aggressive of a hurricane activity coming out of the Atlantic in the long range. I do want to jump over. This is a map that I've shown quite a bit this summer. This is the ECMWF ensemble probabilities of receiving less than a half inch or more. And we've been watching this year. And as we take this out through the forecast, I mean, basically everything west of the divide toward the southwest has been red. So we've had like no chance for getting above a half inch of rain. And starting to see the probabilities of staying below that line regress further to the west, maybe over California, central Washington. But some of these areas, at least some chance for a half inch of rain or more in the southwest. So that's showing that monsoon activity starting to pick up in the long range. And then these areas here, Illinois, getting toward Indiana, Ohio, and then into the Canadian prairie. See this increased chance for staying below that half inch line. So it's interesting seeing this map kind of finally flip around in late August, indicative of kind of a pattern change here where the monsoon picks up later in the summer and we start to get a little bit drier here in the Corn Belt. That is relevant. I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I do want to touch on some of these water levels out west. If we look, this is Lake Powell, kind of on the border between Utah and Arizona on the Colorado River. Blue is 2025. And you can actually see we were doing pretty well relative to the last few years, relative to 24, 23, and 22. In fact, 2025 was the highest. With some poor snowpack last winter, we weren't able to melt as much water into the reservoirs as we did in 24 or 23, just this little bump. And so now all of a sudden, we've been dry this winter across a wide area of the western U.S., and this is starting to sink even faster than it did in recent years. Usually when we get into like August and September, some of that monsoon activity is able to push north, and you see how it kind of flattens out that rate of descent as we get further into the summer. Well, that hasn't happened. I mean, we're still on this nosedive here, and we're heading down, I think, lower until we get some more activity into the western U.S. So watching this closely, we're starting to lose ground on just the last few years, not at 2022 levels. 2021, we started seeing this sink very aggressively all winter as drought built into the western U.S. and getting down to those low levels that we saw in 22. But at least right now, this is not a good trend considering that we might be staring down a La Nina episode in the western U.S. It's kind of a similar story in California. The southern Sierras were dry last winter. Some of the northern Sierras up near the Klamath Mountains were wetter. But if I pick on the Pine Flat Reservoir here, this is in the southern Sierras. Again, 2025 started, relatively normal compared to the last few years. But as we got through the snowmelt season and the lack of rainfall this winter, we're starting to dive down here, getting close to those 2022 levels. So not a big issue right now, but we are below average in the Pine Flat. And if we put on or we stack a poor water year on top of this, this could continue to bottom out depending on when that precipitation comes in. If we look at the rest of the reservoirs across California, Pine Flat, which we were just looking at, is down here. It is the lowest level relative to average of any of the reservoirs here across California, being near the southern Sierras. The Millerton also kind of in that same area below average. Looking at the rest, they're all pretty close to their historical averages or even just above it. So California is doing all right on their reservoir activity. But again, if you add a poor water year on top of this, you're going to see this situation look more like we're seeing in Pine Flat or Millerton very quickly. Now that's relevant with that La Nina watch. Some of these seasonal models have picked up on the chances for La Nina. So if I show you any of these like winter, even fall forecasts for precipitation, this is just the latest ECMWF, October, November, December. It's getting into the early part of the water year. You can see it's going to go over wet. It's not a huge surprise given where we're at with the La Nina being the expectation from the ECMWF seasonal model, from the NMME as well. We typically see a little bit of a wetter water year toward the Pacific Northwest, so seeing some of that activity here. If I take this forecast further, even into December, January, February, this is well out into the forecast now. You kind of see this textbook drier California, wetter Pacific Northwest for the water year here. So this is something to keep an eye on as we go forward. I'm not going to put too much weight into this forecast now because this kind of looks just like a copy and paste La Nina forecast right now. It's always more nuanced than that. If we look at the NMME, this is for October, November, December for the western U.S., drier in Arizona, drier in Utah, Southern California, wetter for the Pacific Northwest. Again, pretty textbook La Nina signature where we're dry south, wetter north. The only caveat I'll put on these seasonal forecasts is their seasonal forecast. They have not performed well historically. If I were to show you from March, our forecast for the summertime precipitation, June, July, August, this was the forecast from the beginning of the year. Look at the dry corridor. This was the drought risk that was a concern from the western plains all the way into the central U.S. And this is what our last 60 days of precipitation have looked like over that time period. I mean, wet in that corridor here. So these summertime seasonal forecasts are never as accurate often as the wintertime ones. So it's not to say I'm going to totally dismiss this dry south and wet north, but La Nina years, El Nino years, there's always nuance to them. We've seen El Nino years in the last decade, which were, near record high in terms of magnitude. That didn't bring the rainfall that was expected to California. And even this decade, we've seen La Nina years that brought copious amounts of atmospheric rivers. So we'll have to see how these things develop as we go into the year, but all else equal, just as a signal, we're leaning drier for the Colorado River and for the California reservoirs right now. If we zoom in, this is the Southern Oscillation. So this is an index that we track to determine kind of where we're heading with La Nina. And when the Southern Oscillation starts to trend up, as it did for much of the early part of the decade, we tend to favor La Nina episodes in the Pacific. And we've seen this slow trend up as we've gone through the summer here. And that's prompted some of that La Nina concern as we get into winter of 25 and 2026. And really all we're looking at here with the Southern Oscillation Index, we're taking the surface pressure from Tahiti, which I think is right here, and we're subtracting it from Darwin, which is right here. So we're saying, is the pressure here higher than Darwin here? If it's higher, we tend to blow trade winds from the Central Pacific toward the Western Pacific, and that tends to cool the waters in the Central Pacific. And so if we have a positive Southern Oscillation, higher pressure here, lower pressure here, we tend to cool the waters in the Central Pacific, tend to have a La Nina episode, and that's kind of what this positive trend is showing us, that more likely to see La Nina here. And we actually don't even need to look at the pressure. You just look at the wind field here. You can see these trades moving from east to west. That just tells us you probably have a higher pressure here blowing these winds east to west toward Australia. So there's that early look at La Nina. And if we look at those La Nina indices, those water temperatures over the last kind of 30 to 60 days have been cooling down. So as we get into middle of August here, we're almost at our lowest value yet that we've seen this summer. So again, La Nina, the expectation, the higher probability chance here as we go into this winter. And the seasonal forecast, at least at this point in August, aren't going to be terribly accurate. It is going to be an evolving story that we'll watch this year. Given the kind of early concerns with the Colorado River levels, some of the California reservoirs dropping below the historical average, our like savings bank of water is starting to be cut down a bit. So that La Nina conversation is something of a concern. With La Nina years, we tend to see above average hurricane activity, and some of that's expected to continue this week. We are watching this area here in the Central Pacific for development. It has been kind of moving a little bit toward the north, and the forecast trends here seeing another potential system behind it. But I mentioned earlier that MJO activity, despite whatever La Nina favorability there is right now, hasn't been as favorable in the long range for hurricanes as we maybe saw when Erin was developing. And I'll show you what I mean by that. If we jump over and look at the ECMWF ensemble, all the different forecast members for this next system that we're watching, expecting very slow development over the next kind of 3 to 5 days. And then maybe getting out into next week, this is valid as a Monday, August 25th, starting to see some of these members develop a system, but it's already starting to turn out to sea on a lot of these forecast scenarios. There is this little camp here. You see all these little L's together that are maybe staying on the southern periphery of the forecast track. And if it gets into here into next Monday, right, maybe a similar position as to where Erin is now, it might be something we'll have to keep a closer eye on. But at least right now, this very slow development, coupled with the fact that a lot of these are turning out to sea, not a huge issue right now, despite being definitely on the radar of the National Hurricane Center. Another system behind it with only a 30% chance of development. But again, if we look at that one, even getting onto the forecast, don't see a strong chance for development right now. Taking the ECMWF forecast out, don't see anything coming out of that. So none of these tracks end up even making it over toward the mainland U.S. So even with those southern camp, a lot of these still turning toward the north eventually as well. And I think after that, we'll see kind of a lull in tropical activity unless we get something more homegrown. We've noted there's been this kind of like persistent precipitation signal in the Bay of Campeche this year that we'll have to keep an eye on. But again, I think if we're going to see some activity kind of in the next 2 to 3 weeks, it's probably going to be maybe a little bit closer to home, something spinning up just off the coast. But I do want to jump back home once more, the continental U.S., just to show some of the precipitation deficits we've been dealing with recently. I talked about that stripe across the upper Midwest, seen plenty of precipitation there. This is valid as of yesterday, so it's going to miss some of the precipitation that we maybe saw in the northern part of Illinois or Indiana. But we are seeing kind of drier areas settle in here over the Four Corners. This area expected to get more active. We saw that in the long-range forecast. Fortunately, this area also expected to get more active in the long-range forecast. We looked at Arkansas, western Mississippi in that 8 to 14-day range, and then New England getting on some precipitation here just this week in the 7-day forecast. So kind of a good news that this kind of oddly shaped drier stretch here has been seeing a better outcome, at least in those long-range forecasts here. And if we just jump over to kind of end the video here, temperature outlook for the 24th through the 28th. This is the 6 to 10-day outlook. Below average temperatures expected for the Midwest. High confidence in this, given that trough that we saw plummeting out of Canada later this week. Higher temperatures move into the western U.S., and as this heat pushes toward the north, when I start to see high temperatures here, I know we're probably going to get some better monsoon activity, definitely in the month of August here. Look at the 6 to 10-day precipitation outlook, definitely bullish on that monsoon activity. Drier in this corridor from the prairie down into the Midwest, but wetter here over New England, wetter in the eastern U.S. Good news for some dry areas here. Good news for some dry areas that we just painted in the four corners in the Front Range area. And if I take this forecast out, even the 26th through September 1st, cooler across the central and eastern U.S., some of this heat expanding further north over Canada, allowing some of these areas to get cooler underneath that, but I think continued monsoonal activity for the desert Southwest, even in that 8 to 14-day range. Climate Prediction Center not as maybe bullish on precipitation in this corridor in the 8 to 14-day range, but if you remember that ECMWF forecast, even some of these other ones, let's scroll down and show you. Saw some of this activity pushing more so into the middle of Mississippi River Valley. That's maybe the one area that we'll have to watch over the next kind of 10 to 15 days to see if we can start to eat away some of those precipitation deficits. I'll leave it here today. Thanks for watching. Eric will be back with you all tomorrow.